With a brief introduction to ethics out of the way, we're now going to turn to think about ethics at an organisational level through thinking through some of the different frameworks for thinking about ethics, and also what we know about ethics as it relates to organisations. How do we get organisations behaving ethically, so to speak? So let's have a look at one framework for thinking about how to conceptualise approaches to ethics. What we have here is an example of taking different approaches to ethics and putting them together and showing their relationship to each other. Now, one of the things that we should note to begin with, and this is probably the most central part about ethics, is that we can make our judgment on whether something is ethical or not based upon a different goal. Is the goal the outcome? That is it about doing good? If so, we're really focusing on teleological or outcome ethics. Or are we really more focused on the process of ethics, how we actually do something? If we're focused on that, then we're actually concerned with deontological ethics. Now, there are classic examples of these, and I'll leave you to have a look at the history of ethics to learn any more about these kind of approaches. But utilitarianism, say from Bentham or Mill, or Kantian perspective as a deontological ethics, they focus on entirely different things. So a utilitarianist approach focuses on maximising the utility in the decision. And so that's summing up the happiness. And whatever creates maximum happiness overall is what is the ethical thing. In contrast, Kant asks, how do we know if something's ethical or not? And he came up with this idea of the categorical imperative and says, if an act meets the categorical imperative, then it's ethical. And he had three conditions for that. The first condition is that you need to have universality. That means the act can be committed by everyone all the time. The second element is that you have to show respect. So you've got to treat people as an ends, not as a means to an ends. So you can't use people. And the third one was that you're responsible for your own actions, not others. Okay. And if an act fit within those parameters, then he would consider it ethical, and that's the way to think about it. There are other views, there are other ways of thinking about ethics within this framework, but in essence, we get a lot of disagreements about ethics because some people are looking at the process, the ontological approach. Some people are looking at the outcome. The old example, so old it's almost trite, of is it okay to torture people? Well, some people say it's inherently wrong, it's the wrong thing to do. Some people say, hey, you know what, if it saves another life, etc., then it's okay. They're focusing then on the outcome, and we can get these differences of opinions. Now, I've focused the discussion here on the lower quadrant, the institutional structure, because we're worried about organisations and companies in particular. So we're worried about institutions getting consistency and fixicity or a uniform, consistent approach to the ethical behaviour that we're after. Bear in mind that there are other approaches which are more focused on the individual, about being adaptive and learning and responding. Virtue ethics, I think Aristotle was a classic around virtue ethics, and the idea there being that the individual learns and gets better and more virtuous, so they won't be consistent over their life. In much the same way, if we then, and that was focused, by the way, on what they do. They have these traits that this is how they do it. They don't look at the outcome, versus learning about the outcome and what to do. We can still have that learning and growth and adaptability, but we're focused more on the outcome. So for instance, Rand ethical egoism is about maximizing every individual's happiness, right? So you can see that focus between learning to do what's good for you versus, say, and institutionally what's best for society. So, lots of different ways to think about ethics. A core difference is the difference between focusing on the ends, teleological approach, versus focusing on the means or the process, the right thing to do, a deontological approach. Now that's in general how we can think of ethics in terms of the frameworks, etc. But it then leads to this particular problem. How do we actually embed ethics within an organisation? Because we're dealing with lots of individuals, are there things we can do within a corporation, within an organisation, to maximise the chance that the people in it will exhibit the behaviour that we're after, however we define that in ethical terms? And indeed, there is a lot of evidence suggesting that we can shape people's behaviour. And this is one of the hearts of the argument around corporate governance, that the systems and processes and policies we put in place in corporations do actually shape, enable, and help people act in certain ways, ethically or unethically. So let's have a bit of a quick look at what some of those factors actually are. So if we're going to focus on our values and the ethics of a situation, it has to be an integrated approach. This is a classic piece of feedback, a very normative approach to the role of ethics and how to embed it in an organisation. So what do we want? What do we start with? Well, we want to know where we are. So where are we? So we need to do a form of self-assessment. It's not going to work if the senior people don't believe in it and don't model the actual behaviour. Okay, that's absolutely critical to any change that we want in an organisation. Now, this particular 10-point plan talks about a code of business conduct. What that's actually doing is it's trying to actually clarify what we want. So it's trying to set it out. And when we've got multiple people, that can be really important. We then need to make sure that the people know about it. Okay. And again, because we have lots of different people in an organisation, that can be a really complex scenario. But communicating isn't enough. Training, resources, responsiveness, and enforcement. That enforcement and response will include monitoring, right, through audits and measurement, even if it's qualitative measurement. But we need to make sure that we monitor and embed it, enforce the behaviours that we actually expect. It's only when we get this consistent and holistic approach that we can expect or hope to see a change in behaviour. So one of the things that comes through in this particular piece of advice to us for an organisation, and generally in the area, is that organisations could use a code of conduct. So what actually is a code of conduct? Well, it's an explicit sign that the company is committed to a way of doing business. It's often aspirational, educational in terms of what it's there to do and how it's meant to help, but it provides guidance for those in the organisation. In a minimalist way, it might be limited just to anti-corruption practice or conflicts of interest, but others can take on a broader role of how we would like people within our organisations to act. It can be that central guide and reference and the support for day-to-day decisions. We can see in this definition that it's got to be this statement so things are clear, and often it's set out as the minimal standard of behaviour, and that makes it very clear to people what they might be expected to do. If we actually had a code, what can we expect to come out of it? Well, the first thing that you can get is you get a document. And so that provides evidence that you're paying attention to those things that you deem are important. It's a great induction and educational tool, as we've talked about. It can be a way of identifying and resolving difficult issues. So it could be a mechanism for dispute resolution, as well as being a legitimisation or a best practice approach. But part of the problem comes is when we just focus on the document itself. A lot of the benefits of a code of conduct actually come from the process. And as we can see here, a lot of those benefits come from establishing norms, doing team building, reflective exercises. It's actually the development that shapes what we agree to act like into the future. So that development activity is fundamental to the benefits that can actually come from a code. Now, there are potential flaws in using a code of conduct. They can really backfire. In fact, codes that aren't enforced are often a sign of a less ethical organisation, and there's some studies actually showing this. So how do we know that we're running into problems? Well, the first thing is if you actually really don't use it. If it's just a dust collector, then it's not going to be useful for the organisation. That has legal implications if you don't do what you're going to say you'll do, and we can talk about that when we talk about due care and diligence and policy and process in a governance setting. It can mean that we're seen as two-faced if we say one thing and do another, and they can also sometimes lack relevance and be not applicable to the organisation, and therefore get in the way. A second flaw in employing a code is that you can think, well, we've dealt with that. We don't need to talk about ethics anymore. But really, a good ethical program will keep revisiting the core ideas, adapting and revising to make sure they fit with the organisation. One of the worst ways you can develop a code is to have a dedicated ethics officer or corporate counsel develop it, because we miss that whole process component of shaping the employees that's necessary to develop and embed a culture which will shape the behaviour of how people within the organisation act.